Yes, I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Tim Carter. A particular pleasure for me, as I've long been a fan, he doesn't know that, but I've long been a fan of his work on Monteverdi, Peri, the contemporaries. Tim Carter completed his PhD in 1980 at the University of Birmingham in the UK with a dissertation, Jacopo Peri, 1561 to 1633, His Life and Works, later published as a book in 1989. Professor Carter's other books include the Cambridge Opera Handbook on Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, 1987, Music in Late Renaissance and Early Baroque Italy, 1992, Music, Patronage and Printing in Late Renaissance Florence, and Monteverdi and his contemporaries of 2000. Monteverdi's Musical Theatre, 2002, and something different, Oklahoma, The Making of an American Musical, in 2007. In 2001, Professor Carter moved from the Royal Holloway at the University of London to become David G. Fry Distinguished Professor of Music at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the US. He's served on the boards of the Royal Musical Association in the UK and the American Musicological Society, and from 2003 to 2006 he was President of the Society for 17th Century Music. He currently has several essays on Monteverdi, newly published or in press, has just completed a critical edition of Kurt Weill's first musical play composed in the United States, Johnny Johnson, and he is co-authoring with the economic historian Richard Goldthwaite a book titled Orpheus in the Marketplace, Jacopo Peri and the Economy of Late Renaissance Florence. This book draws on a newly discovered set of financial accounts concerning Peri, his family and his commercial ventures, due to be published in just a few months. Professor Carter is currently in Australia as a Senior Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the ARC Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions, based in Perth. So we're grateful that the Centre for the History of Emotions has assisted his visit to Sydney this week and that he's able to be with us this afternoon. So, with pleasure, I now hand over to Professor Carter to speak to us on performing Monteverdi, some problems and a few solutions. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you to the Con, and thank you to all the students I've had such fun working with over the past week. Often when I speak with performance students, I'm pressed to justify what I do as a musicologist. The common argument is that everything lies in the musical notes, so why bother with anything else? Recently, I encountered an even more extreme version of that position. Musicologists are fine for writing program essays, that is, giving audiences the background to what they need to know. But as far as anything else is concerned, musicologists are totally and utterly irrelevant. My opponent said, so as long as one plays the music, quote, with sincerity and reverence, nothing more is needed. Thus spoke a clearly talented performer in a highly reputable conservatoire. Sincerity and reverence. We need nothing more. Well, those of us committed to the ideas and ideals promoted by the so-called early music movement over the past 40 years know that matters are a bit more complicated than that. We will all agree that early music is more a frame of mind than a repertory. We will mostly agree that an essential part of the mix is provided by historically informed performance, HIP or HIP. We will also mostly agree that musical content and meaning are contingent upon time and place, and that before we can sing or play the notes, we need to know what lies within and behind them, what the notes contain, what the notes do not contain. We may even agree that in hip spheres, performance and musicology have long been fairly happily married. And we collectively rejoice that, save for pockets of resistance, we have entered the musical mainstream, and are extending our influence therein both chronologically and in terms of the canon. However, those pockets of resistance to hipness remain. They remain within our educational institutions, they remain among some concert providers, and they even remain among our audiences. We probably no longer count as historicizing eccentrics alongside, say, that worthy band of Civil War reenactors. And we have shed our hippie image, even as we still claim to be hip. But we might sometimes, and sometimes fairly, be accused of opportunism for commercial gain. Or we're accused of escapism from the music of our time. Or we're accused of the exotic fakery of the heritage industry in the manner of ye olde tea shoppy. Nor has postmodernism helped our cause. The early music revival, or at least one 20th century version of it, was once part of a modernist agenda, even as it resisted certain strains of musical modernism. Many will remember, perhaps even with nostalgia, those old new concerts where each camp sought to validate the other. Old music validating new music validating old music. But now that anything and everything is up for postmodern grabs, our agendas have become more diffuse, and they've also become more fuzzy. So, a charitable reading of my opponent's plea for sincerity and reverence is that it was a sign of postmodern confusion. Sincerity, honesty, integrity is one way out of the relativist quagmire, while reverence for things past helps defend against a confused present and an uncertain future. Nor, I imagine, would we ourselves claim to be anything less than sincere or reverent in our own early music endeavors, even as we accept the contingency of our sincerity. Our interpretations change from day to day, or even if we argue that irreverence is not always irreverent. What keeps us sincere is some kind of belief that how music was done in its time might plausibly have an impact on how we do it now, whether that involves period instruments, context-specific performance practices, or recreating some sense of original music-making environments. We are no longer so naive as to claim the authority of authenticity, the A word, in support of such beliefs. But our historicist position is not necessarily as opposed to a transcendentalist or a universalist one as might be claimed by those who resist being hip. There is no contradiction in the idea that music speaks to all time, yet does so from a given time. Nor are those musicians aligned against historically informed performance any less bound by history, despite presentist claims to the contrary. One area in which we perhaps most differ from the universalists, however, is our sense of the contextual contingency of musical notation. Before we can deliver the notes, we need to know what those notes signify. And we need to accept that even the same notes do not signify the same things in all times and all places. In that sense, not much at all is in the notes, and what needs adding to them requires more than just sincerity or reverence to uncover it. Hip performers know full well just how much hard work is involved in learning new conventions and unlearning old ones by way either of reading between the notes themselves or of digging deep into those musical, textual, and visual sources that might tell us what the notes mean. We also accept the impermanence of whatever solutions might emerge in any given moment, given the constant impulse for new research and new ways of thinking. Indeed, one might claim that this is the most important contribution that we have made to the wider performance world. The understanding that nothing is fixed, that everything should be questioned over and over again, and that we have many, many tools to make even familiar music sound fresh, vital, and yes, even new. So by now, I've probably raised a few hackles in this room today. You're getting restive because you think that you see before you just another arrogant musicologist claiming to tell the musical world what to do. I've probably upset you even more because I seem to be claiming a position of hip superiority. Hip superiority which some of you might endorse, but not all of you, I imagine. But I'm not here to beat you over the head for playing Bach on a piano. I'm not upset if you ignore Beethoven's metronome markings. I don't mind if you perform the Debussy piano preludes in a manner that would have sounded totally foreign to Debussy. Nor do I claim that hip performers always get it right. Indeed, I shall show that hip performers can often be very unhip. All of the examples we shall be hearing today come from highly sincere and even reverent performing groups that I admire, some of which I've even collaborated with. But if they can't get things right, what hope is there for the rest of us in this musical world? So let's get down to brass tacks. My subject is Claudio Monteverdi, the foremost Italian composer of the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods. He was employed at the Gonzaga court in Mantua from 1591 to 1612. As Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga's Maestro della Musica, he was in charge of all musical production within the court, whether in the church, in the chamber, or in the theatre. And Monteverdi's first opera, Orfeo of 1607, is the earliest opera to be performed fairly regularly on the modern stage. And it is to Act 1 of Orfeo that I now turn. Orpheus is about to marry his beloved Eurydice, and the chorus of shepherds and shepherdesses celebrate the occasion. Lasciati monti. Leave the mountains, leave the springs, move your feet to the dance, let your carols fill the air with joyful celebration. So, this is all well and good. And the Philip Pickett recording you've just heard captures the atmosphere quite nicely. But the score of Lasciati Monti reveals some issues. One of the several problems of this chorus is that it is in 3 sections distinguished by meter. The opening Lasciati Monti in common time, a second section in some kind of triple time marked 3-2, and an instrumental ritornello in a compound duple time 6-4. The question is how to manage the shift from one section to another, from common time to 3-2 to 6-4. In other words, how do we beat time? Philip Pickett, in effect, counts 4 in the opening section, has the crotchet become a minim in the triple time, and then takes the ritornello in triplets relative to the minims of the opening common time. Count it out as you listen again. Pickett is probably right so far as the 6/4 ritornello goes, but he is definitely wrong for the middle section. Sorry. In this period, a 3/2 time signature is a proportional one, 3 in the time of 2. Now, we can argue over which 3 goes in the time of which 2, but having a crotchet become a minim is not a proportional relationship on any metrical level. Another performer, Emanuel Heim, gets closer in terms of proportions. This is her version of the same piece. Heim goes proportional between the first and second sections, between the common time and the 3/2. But despite that, there is something even more fundamentally wrong here. The too fast tempo for the whole chorus. Now, note, here I'm not talking about playing the music on the appropriate period instruments. I'm not talking about the question of vocal production. I'm not talking about questions of tuning and temperament. In other words, all the parameters that one would conventionally associate with being hip, with historically informed performance. My issue applies to the music whether performed on a kazoo or a didgeridoo, whether at A equals 414 or A 440, or whether performed by whatever natural or unnatural voices you care to imagine. I'm concerned rather with far more basic issues of tempo and meter, not about how the music sounds, but how it goes. And quite simply, it is not possible to take Lasciati Monti at Heim's speed, because to do so misses the entire point of the piece. Anyone in this room who is proficient in Baroque dance will probably already have realized where my argument is heading. Lasciati Monti is styled a balletto. Questo balletto fu cantato al suono di 5 viole da braccio, 3 chitarroni, and so on. This piece is meant to be not just sung and played, it is also meant to be danced. And contemporary dance manuals give plenty of examples of dance sequences that move from duple time to triple time to a version of compound duple time. And here is one from Fabrizio Carozzo's treatise Nobiltà di Dame, published in 1600. Common time goes to 3, goes to a faster saltarello. Carozzo also gives very precise verbal instructions in terms of the appropriate dance steps for each section of such dances. The opening duple time section, then the triple time gagliarda, and then the faster saltarello. Take Carozzo's instructions and apply them to the music, taking at the tempo we've just heard in the case of Monteverdi, and you will very quickly fall over 2 left feet. It is quite simply not possible to dance at the speed of the music as Emanuel Heim performs it. So, as I promised, I am not setting up hip performers as saints and the rest of the performing world as sinners. Indeed, supposedly hip performers can be as sinful as non-hip performers can be saintly, depending on their musical intuition or just on plain musical common sense. Let me give you an example of what I would regard as a particularly sinning example from someone often regarded as a saint in hip circles. Alan Curtis released a recording of Monteverdi's duets and trios where he vaunted what he claimed was a major discovery concerning the duet Zeffiro torna e di soavi accenti. The text is a sonnet by the Florentine poet Ottavio Rinuccini that plays on another well-known sonnet by Petrarch. But for those of you who know how sonnets go, there is something very odd in Monteverdi's version of the text. His first line, Zeffiro torna e di soavi accenti, cannot be correct in terms of the typical rhyme scheme of a sonnet. Accenti does not have any matching rhyme, whereas sonnets have a very regular rhyme scheme. In fact, Rinuccini's original text was Zeffiro torna e di soavi odori. Zephyr, the west wind of spring, returns not with sweet accents, according to Rinuccini's text, but with sweet perfumes. Odori rhymes perfectly correctly with fiori, clori, and canori. Accenti does not rhyme with anything. Therefore, in a spirit of philological and literary rectitude, Alan Curtis restores the original text, claiming authenticity in the process. In the liner notes to that recording, Alan Curtis claims that he has uncovered the original version of Monteverdi's Zeffiro torna e di soavi accenti, instead reading it as Zeffiro torna e di soavi odori. But this is authenticity run riot. Monteverdi's problem is that while perfumes, odori, are perfectly pleasant to the nose, there is no way to recreate their sensation in musical terms. His accenti, accents, makes much more sense. In the early 17th century, this is a musical term. A singer applies accenti, ornaments or embellishments, to music. You cannot sing about smells, perfumes, but you can certainly sing about singing. Indeed, doing so is often what justifies music in the first place. It should be noted, however, that even in a more commonsensical world, not every apparent error that Monteverdi makes can be fixed by performers. Zeffiro torna continues to extol the delights of spring, but then Monteverdi makes a terrible mistake. The problem lies in the line, "E da monti e da valli, ime e profonde," while from the mountains and valleys, deep and low. Rinuccini's poem talks about how echoes redouble the harmony from the mountains and valleys, ime e profonde. And Monteverdi, as we all know, is a perfectly good painter of words. He goes high for the mountains and deep for the valleys. He then goes high for ime and low for profonde, creating a distinction between the Monti ime and the Valli profonde. The problem is that the old Tuscan word ime does not mean high, and it is never applied to mountains. Rather, ime, if you know your Dante, means deep in a vertical sense, whereas profonde means deep in a horizontal sense. So, Rinuccini's valleys are deep in two ways, lengthwise and in terms of depth. Monteverdi simply does not know the meaning of an old Tuscan word. And at that point, there's not much one can do to cover Monteverdi's error except by altering the translation of the text, which is what most CD liner notes do. They usually translate this text as from the mountains high and the valleys low, which is not what the Italian says. This, of course, is an absurd strategy, but it also explains the lengths to which people will go to uphold the idea of Monteverdi as faithful servant of his texts, supposedly the foundational principle of his so-called seconda pratica. However, if you don't like the idea of Monteverdi not understanding an old Tuscan word, it would make much more sense to argue that his mistake is deliberate. In other words, that Monteverdi is making a joke. And I'm going to come back to Monteverdi's evident sense of humor. It's very underestimated because, of course, we don't expect this music to be funny. But in fact, it can be. Going back to Lasciati Monti from Orfeo, Pickett's and Haim's mistakes could have been avoided if they'd thought about what musical notation means and what the purpose of the music might have been, in this case, dancing. Indeed, a good musicological editor could have sorted them both out very easily. But this is not always to say that musicologists necessarily get it right. There's a rather strange notational issue in Act 2 of Orfeo, where the printed edition of 1609 seems to have an E sharp over an A in the basso continuo. The soprano line is in the C1 clef, and the basso continuo line is in the F4 clef. So we have the E sharp over an A in the bass. This is clearly implausible in musical terms, and it would be very easy to dismiss it as a printer's error, which is how almost all editors of the piece have treated it. But the interesting thing about printers' errors is to wonder how they might have arisen in the first place. Of course, one option is that the typesetter was just careless. He wasn't paying attention. But even carelessness can have its causes. In the case of that problematic E sharp, the typesetter cannot just have invented it from nothing. There must have been something in his exemplar that prompted him to print the symbol of a sharp. Having asked the question, the answer comes easily enough. In this period, continuo figures are placed above the bass line and not below. Therefore, that sharp was probably a continuo figure, indicating a raised third in the A harmony. That continuo figure must have been poorly positioned in the typesetter's exemplar, such that the typesetter read it as an accidental instead. The logical solution for any editor would be not to dismiss the sharp as a mere printing error, but rather to transfer the sharp to the continuo figuring, to indicate an A major harmony, not an A minor harmony. Not a single editor of Monteverdi's Orfeo has done so. Here we have an A minor chord, not an A major chord. Viewed in this light, other apparent misprisions in the typesetting of Orfeo can be even more revealing. In Act 4 of Orfeo, there's a rather odd rubric above a recitative for one of the spirits of the underworld, un tono più alto, meaning that it is to be sung in a higher key, in other words, to be transposed. This is rather puzzling. But once more, asking the question opens the door to possible answers. Here you need to know two things. First, it is clear that Monteverdi's Orfeo was meant to be performed by a small cast of 9 or 10 singers, with most of those singers doubling up roles and singing together as the chorus. This makes absolutely perfect sense, given that the Mantuan court capella had 9 or 10 singers on its staff. Most performances of Orfeo nowadays will tend to have 25 to 30 singers on the stage. The second thing you need to know is that there seems to have been some revision to the ending of the opera around the time of the first performances. The printed librettos associated with those performances in 1607 have one ending to the opera. Orfeo fails the test in the underworld, loses Eurydice forever, and returns to the fields of Thrace to lament his fate until he is carried off by a group of bacchantes. The score, however, has Orfeo raised to heaven by his father, the god Apollo, who appears on a cloud machine in the middle of Act 5. There has been much discussion over when the change of ending might have occurred. However, given the small cast, 9 or 10 singers, adding Apollo would have forced some reassignment of the preceding roles so that a singer would have time to change costume, go to the dressing room, come back from the dressing room, climb the ladder to get into the cloud machine at the top of the stage to come down as Apollo in the middle of Act 5. This is almost certainly why a recitative in Act 4 needed to be transposed upward. The singer who originally sang it instead took the role of Apollo, so the recitative had to be transposed to suit another voice. In other words, the typesetter of the edition of Orfeo had in front of him a score that also contained an annotation reflecting a change to the opera made in rehearsal or in production. The typesetter was meant to act on that instruction, i.e. to transpose the recitative up, or the typesetter was meant to ignore it. It's simply a performance annotation. But instead, the typesetter did what all typesetters do, and simply reproduced what he had in front of him. But his mistake is triply significant. First, it tells us that Monteverdi sent a score for typesetting that had been used at least for rehearsal, a score that reflected changing circumstances as a performance was set in train. Someone had to write down, take this up a tone. Second, the Apollo ending was indeed performed at some point, rather than just added to the 1609 score for whatever reason. And third, this typesetter's error confirms the argument that Orfeo was indeed done with a small cast, raising questions of how many singers one needs to perform Monteverdi's opera today. As I'm sure you all know, transposing roles to suit voices is standard in opera of most music historical periods, and performance materials often contain annotations to that effect. One finds them littered all over the manuscripts of, say, Monteverdi's two surviving Venetian operas, Il Ritorno d'Ulisse in Patria and L'Incarnazione di Poppaea. Here is a page from L'Incarnazione. This is from Act 1, Scene 4, between Poppaea and her nurse Arnalta. And at some point, Arnalta's music needed to be transposed up a fourth, alla quarta alta. You have the instruction there in the center. Presumably, this was to adapt the music to a new singer. This annotation, alla quarta, is in the hand of the composer Francesco Cavalli, who clearly had a role in the revival of Monteverdi's L'Incarnazione sometime in the 1650s, some 10 years after Monteverdi's death. And we can have plenty of fun considering who that new singer might have been, and why the role was transposed so significantly and changed as a result. But this page also reveals another well-known performance problem with L'Incarnazione di Poppea. On this page, not only do we have an alla quarta instruction, transposing the recitative up, but at the bottom there is also an instrumental ritornello, right at the bottom, down there. An instrumental ritornello for which only the bass line is given. On the next page of the score, someone has tried to provide two upper parts for this ritornello, but they've done so rather badly. They would not gain a grade A in Harmony 102, as studied at the Con. Here, of course, we enter a minefield. The surviving sources for Venetian operas of the 1640s and 1650s often have these kinds of lacunae, these kinds of gaps, missing instrumental parts, gaps in the vocal lines, so on and so forth. They are indicative of the performative contingency of these manuscripts. These manuscripts are not perfect library copies, but rather they reflect musical life in the theatre, as works were performed and re-performed, and where fluidity and flexibility are the names of the game. As for the role of instruments in an opera like L'Incarnazione di Poppea, this famously led Raymond Lepard to add instrumental accompaniments to the opera all over the place in his pioneering revival of L'Incarnazione at Glyndebourne in 1962. Of course, Ray Lepard had very little choice, given the need to use the house orchestra at Glyndebourne, the London Philharmonic Orchestra. The Lepard version of L'Incarnazione is still available for purchase on CD or DVD. It can still be rented for performance, and indeed many opera houses still do the Lepard version of L'Incarnazione, even though it makes any hip musician cringe in pain. But what are we meant to do with all those places in L'Incarnazione where we know instruments did indeed play, as with this ritornello in Act 1, Scene 4? René Jacobs, perhaps surprisingly, goes for the appallingly bad version of the upper parts. However, John Eliot Gardiner goes for something quite different. Same bass line, different upper parts. And Gabriel Garrido goes for something different again. So, who is right? You might feel that they all are, each in their own way. In other words, a blank space in a score gives the performer the freedom to do what she or he might wish on the spur of the moment, so long as something, anything, happens at the right time. Here, the musicologist can help. John Eliot Gardiner's ritornello was in fact composed by Peter Holman, working quite carefully within the stylistic parameters of the period. But the musicologist cannot provide the definite right answer, even if she might be able to demonstrate some definite wrong ones. There are other times in Monteverdi too when even the most creative editor is stumped. The 1610 Vespers is a well-known minefield that has generated huge controversies in the literature. Proportional triple times of a kind we saw in Lasciati Monti and Orfeo, the whole question of whether to transpose those parts of the Vespers that are in so-called high clefs, chiavette rather than chiavi naturali, and we argue incessantly over whether the 1610 Vespers ever was conceived as a single musical work or should be performed as a single musical work today, whether within or outside some kind of liturgical context. But even when matters seem more straightforward, they are not. Take part of the Magnificat, Suscepit Israel. Here there are no problems of triple time proportions. We can transpose or not transpose it depending on what you think about the high clefs. We have all the notes. Nothing needs adding. But what do these notes mean? The piece has a one-flat signature and is in some form of Lydian mode, normally expressed as the white note scale F to F, here transposed down a fifth, B flat to B flat. The typical problem with the Lydian mode is the tritone created by the F to B natural, which is often modified by altering the B natural to B flat. In other words, turning the Lydian mode into a transposed Ionian mode, the white note scale C to C transposed down a fifth F to F. In the case of an already transposed Lydian mode, as in Suscepit Israel, this means adding E flats, creating a twice transposed Ionian mode down a fifth from C to F, then down another fifth from F to B flat. And if that has confused you, let me just put the question much more simply. Should we perform Suscepit Israel in B flat major or not, with E flats as well as B flats? Monteverdi notates some E flats, but not all of them. So are the E's not marked flat meant to be sung as E flats by association? Or are those E's not marked flat meant to be sung as E naturals? A literal reading of the notation would force the latter. E flats when marked and E naturals when not. But anyone familiar with musica ficta, however, will know that this is not entirely plausible. Singers of music in this period were often expected to add accidentals when they are not notated, and according to various rules. But the issue involves some fairly tough choices, and different performers make different solutions. See what you think of Konrad Jungenel and Cantus Kern. Does it work well? Or does it make you feel slightly seasick? E flats, or E naturals, or a mixture of the two. Now, if we were sitting in a classroom discussing Renaissance musical notation, I would probably engage in a very long, very boring disquisition on solmization, as well as on the standard rule learnt by all would-be singers in the 16th and early 17th century. Una nota supra la semper est canendum fa. If I read enough early 17th century music treatises with proper care and attention, I could also come up with a reasonable or even perfect musicological solution to the problem of these E-flats and E-naturals. But would that serve any purpose? It may, in fact, be a mistake to find a single answer to the E-flat question. Multiple answers are possible, and agonizing over which one to choose may, in fact, miss a point. Now, I am not advocating postmodern relativism here, anything goes, nor am I advocating just being lazy. My point, and perhaps Monteverdi's point, is that Sushepit Israel sets the performer a conundrum, what to do with all those E's. Then another game gets added into the mix. Given that this is a duet, the second soprano needs to pay attention to the first, matching E-flat for E-flat and E-natural for E-natural, and relying on musical instinct to resolve whatever clashes ensue in the heat of the moment. In other words, Monteverdi keeps the performer on his or her toes. He makes the performers live on the edge. We need to remember that Monteverdi was not just a composer, but also himself a performer and a director of the music at the court of the Gonzagas in Mantua, and then at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. Like any composer, he knew that he needed to keep the performers on his side. Like any ensemble director, he knew also how to keep them engaged in the long daily grind of rehearsal and performance. As everyone in this room knows full well, musicians have a wicked sense of humor, which they need to survive, not just the stress, but also the relentlessness of our profession. We all know, too, that musicians like playing insider practical jokes on one another. I very much like the idea of Monteverdi, the composer-director, setting up challenges to keep his performers on their toes and therefore more attentive to the performance. It's a very neat trick to gain the best musical results. For all of us, performers and musicologists alike, music is in effect a license to have fun. Profound, creative fun, but fun nonetheless. And fun not just at playing music, but fun also at playing with music. But most fun activities come with responsibilities attached. And one of the main points in my presentation today has been to illustrate the kinds of boundaries within which fun might be had. I've been talking about Monteverdi, but I could just as well have been talking about any other composer from any other music historical period, even up to the present day. If one accepts at least some of the premises lying behind hipness, those premises are not limited to any particular repertory. Nor, in the end, can I, as a mere musicologist, tell performers what to do. But I can at least offer advice on what not to do. That is, if anyone will listen. I cannot necessarily say what is right, but I can certainly say what I think is wrong, and hope that someone will pay attention. My main aim today, however, has to be to show just what fun there has to be had with Monteverdi's music, with all music. And that alone is good enough for me. Thank you very much.